clicking on the video. In this truck, we talked about dialogue, and we're joined by John Vervaeke, who is a great friend of CU. He's an associate professor of cognitive psychology and cognitive science at the University of Toronto. We talked about questions like, how can we normalize more productive dialogues? And this was a very stimulating conversation, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. So without further ado, here is the Trek.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Trek. The Trek is a Civics Unplugged series where community members participate in meaningful discussions on topics that are too often neglected when thinking about building the future. Through prompting questions and provocations, we venture together into complex but important conversations related to building the future and democracy. We understand that this work requires ongoing dialogue, but it's a journey worth trekking through. I'm Madison. I'm a high school senior from Verdigris, Oklahoma, joined by some of our community members and a special guest, which you will get to hear from in just a moment. And today we are talking about dialogue, and we're starting off with a word association. So when you see your name on the screen, go ahead and introduce yourself and say the 1 to 3 words you associate with the topic and why. And Chabu, feel free to get us started off.
All right, sounds good. Hi, everyone. My name is Chabu Kapumba. I am 19, a first year at the University of Toronto, and a proud builder of this community. And when I think of dialogue, I think of the words primary technology. Technology is a tool, and I think dialogue is probably one of the most important tools that we have. And it's also pretty timeless. So those are the words that come to mind.
So I can go ahead and jump in. Hey everyone, my name is Ashley. I'm 17 from Vancouver, Washington. When I think of dialogue, I think of empathy and process. I think one of the coolest things about dialogue is being able to slip into someone else's worldview and exercise empathy, and process, because I think dialogue is really all about helping people kind of make sense of information and kind of reach new collective understanding. And so it's less about like entering into dialogue with an intended end in mind.
Hey guys, my name is Jacob. I'm 17 and I'm from Jericho, New York. So when I think of dialogue, a couple words I think of is like minds melting together. I think of like a distributed cognition, kind of like where people think together and work together to think new thoughts.
Hi, I'm Sam. I'm a sophomore and I'm from Northern Virginia. The words that come to mind are building relationships, because I think dialogue is a really great place to start for just like building bonds between people, and that could go like really great or not so great.
Hi, my name is Nuid. I'm 17. I'm a high school senior from Chicago. And the 3 words that come to mind for me, the first one is skill, because I feel like it takes practice to get good at having good dialogue. And also small talk, because I think especially pre and during and probably post-COVID, it's a form of dialogue that we need to engage in more.
Hi, my name is Thanasi. I'm 18, co-founder at CU, and I'm in New York City. I think the 3 words are low resolution connection, because while we do use dialogue to build connection, I think it's a very, very inadequate way of expressing all the great things that are in our heads to other humans.
Hi everyone, my name is Bernardo. I'm Mexican. I live in Mexico. I think it's junior. Well, my 3 words are actually 4, and it's the best tool for success.
Hi, I'm John Vervaeke. I'm an associate professor of cognitive psychology and cognitive science at the University of Toronto. And for me, the words would be emergence in collective intelligence.
Hey everyone, I'm Gary, one of the co-founders of CU, calling in from New York City. I'm also going to cheat a little bit and use 4 words, more than a means. I think I used to think of dialogue as kind of a way to just, using my productivity mindset, but dialogue is life.
And for me, I would say listening. because for a long time I thought dialogue was more about talking and what you add to the conversation, but I found over time that it's you learn more and gain more when you just learn to listen better. So thank you all for sharing. We can go ahead and hop into the conversation now. So does anyone have a question or provocation to get us started off with? If not, I have one that I can ask. So how do we normalize productive dialogues?
I think I've been doing a lot of like podcasting and reading about the different kind of universe of facts that people live in, and just the ability to pigeonhole yourself. And I think that the first step in normalizing productive dialogues is making sure that we're all talking about the same thing when we're having dialogues, because I think it's very easy to totally miss the point and hear someone but not actually listen to them when in dialogue.
Adding on to that, I think like another thing that happens when people talk, because like talking itself isn't dialogue. I think a problem that happens is like when people will talk, they'll just want to be right. They'll want to like, force their framing of a situation or their opinion of something onto somebody else. So I think for effective dialogue, we kind of need to step back from our opinions a bit and let other people talk too, which is why listening is an important factor in dialogue.
I think it's also grounded in the topics that we choose to discuss. So before leveling up to more debatable ideas, it's good just to have productive dialogues about things that we are kind of mutually agreed upon. And then you can transition to having conversations that might be a little bit more divisive. So the types of conversations that we deem worthy of a dialogue are also really telling.
John, I know you want to jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe challenge what is meant here by normalized. One of the things that I think defines what I call dialogos is how it's an extraordinary kind of event. Things emerge that are unexpected, unpredicted, and often are challenging to the people that participate in them. So I want to get a little bit clearer about how the question doesn't presume that we're going to try to remove those really, I think, central characteristics of dialogos.
So essentially you want to keep dialogos like more sacred, more like not making it an everyday, every single conversation kind of a thing, keeping it more special.
Well, yeah, because I guess what I want it to be is I want it to be a place that has that sense of sacredness to it, like you said, Jacob, where people get a sense of something larger than themselves with a sort of normative standard greater than their own egocentrism that can challenge them towards which they can aspire.
I wonder if looking at, oh, go ahead, Gary. I don't want to.
Well, I just wanted to, to mention that it's hard to know what to kind of strive towards unless you're able to see really good examples of what John was talking about. And I think that's that's a big service that I feel like John and a few of the people in that sort of orbit have done really well, like Jordan Hall, etc. That it really just feels like you're getting to a place where you wouldn't have gone otherwise, and there's like the sense of fellowship, right, over the course of the dialogue, instead of like something more engineered or transactional or forced, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the defining features is, that's why I use the Greek word dialogos, by way of the logos. There should be a logos It should be something that gathers itself together, takes on a life of its own. And one of the things I'm hoping to do with this is we do not lack from many venues in which people are trying to standardize our communication, and trying to make it so that people come into something. I often use it, this sort of criterion. If the participants get to places that they can't get to individually on their own, then dialogos has occurred. If they could have gotten to that place on their own, then they've just been sharing monologues with each other, and that's a really important difference. We share monologues all the time, and they have a value. But I'm saying too much. I'll shut up.
I think that was perfect. I wonder if it's more of creating, like, if Dialogos is more of a ritual, I wonder if it's creating the physical space and like the mental space to allow that ritual to kind of occur, right? Like just like prayer or meditation, you need to really be in the mindset to even be able to spark an upward conversation where you build upon someone instead of just monologuing out loud.
I totally agree with that. I think there are a bunch of practices you can do that afford you getting into Dialogos. I tend to call those set of practices dialectic. These are things you can do that will afford it. A great Guy Senstock compares it to, you get all the fuel for a fire together, but that's not the same thing as the spark catching and the flame spreading. So yeah, I think there's lots of things you do in order to try and set up the possibility of the sacred space. But if you get into the mindset that you're going to make it happen, then it's precisely not sacred. That's like trying to make somebody your friend. It's not going to work. There's things you can do that will increase the chance of friendship, but if you try to make it, it doesn't happen. You have to create the situation in which it takes a life of its own. And that's the fellowship part of Dialogos that has been mentioned. It's that we're doing something like the way we try to participate in the co-emergence of friendship. We're doing that in Dialogos.
So I have a question. Do we feel like that most people have access to spaces, environments where they can experience Dialogos, and why or why not?
I think that there are people who have had experiences that are quite similar to kind of having these sacred conversations, but it's hard to understand because it's not like explicitly mentioned, you don't know that you can emulate it in other spaces, if that makes sense. So in terms of just like having a conversation that's contingent on the fact that I need to have it with other people to arrive to a good conclusion, those are the types of conversations that you have with like your really close friend groups. But that being said, not knowing that this type of conversation is like, there's a phrase in the name for it, there are characteristics and qualities, and therefore it can be transitioned into other more formalized spaces, is why, even though it may exist, it's not widespread.
Yeah. Regarding to the question, the most people have access to environments where we can experience the dialogue. I think it's like soccer around the world. It's the most popular sport. Even though you don't have the courts, you play it. I think it happens the same with dialogue. You don't have to have a table, to have a specific place where you can have dialogue. I think dialogue can be seen everywhere, from an area where you work, from in your college, in your house, everywhere you have dialogue. Although we don't have, or we have environments that make it easier, dialogue will happen. So yeah, that's my answer to the question.
I love that analogy in the sense of I know like there's the running joke that like for a good period of time, like if you're going to unmute or say something, like it has to be profound, and you're almost setting up like a really weird expectation for like what you're going into conversation with. And so I think in the same way that like dialogue is constantly existing, it's a matter of like harnessing the like I like thinking about like the energy of the conversation going into it, what that looks like. And I think that like going into a conversation, expecting that it's going to be this like moment where you realize such profound things about yourself, can make it harder to realize profound things about yourself in conversation, as compared to like realizing afterwards, even if it's something as simple as like a conversation about like a thing that made you laugh in the day. You can still learn something about yourself and like reap the benefits of the conversation if it's approached in regards and with the right energy.
I totally agree. I think that there are some spaces that might even be counter to true dialogos. Like I think of schools as one of them, and there's a very obvious pedagogy. There's a very obvious, like, when you speak, you're not really trying to build off of your classmate. You're trying to answer the question correctly and say your piece and then put your head down. And so I think it's a much more powerful way of like educating a bunch of students in batches, but it doesn't prepare kids to go out into the world and like have these really powerful experiences with language.
100%. Ashley, do you want to mention what you talked about in the chat?
Yeah, I was just saying that I think a lot of values in Western society actually disincentivize dialogue. So for example, like when we think about like the productivity, like how successful a conversation is, so much of that is like measured by like whether or not we reach certain conclusions or like how quickly we were able to make decisions. And I don't think that necessarily aligns with the values of dialogue. Yeah, just leave it at that.
Yeah, that goes to an idea that I share with James Carse. I had a conversation with him on the Stoa. Unfortunately, he just passed away. He makes a distinction between finite and infinite games. And most of our conversations are finite games. We're trying to get something done. We're trying to convince other people. And so most conversation is about trying to convince and come to conclusion. And that's a finite game. An infinite game is one in which you're playing it for its own sake. And one of the things you can do in the game is modify the rules by which you're playing the game. And so I try to say, you're not trying to convince anybody, you're trying to connect. And you're not trying so much to communicate it is to commune. And so I think Noor is right. You shouldn't go into this I'm going to say profound things. That's like sitting down and saying, now I'm going to have an insight. I'm just going to have an insight now. It's not going to work. It doesn't work that way. But what you can do is you can train mindfulness. You can train ways of interaction so that you can get in a shared flow state with other people. You can do something with language like what musicians do with jazz. And you can sort of apprentice that and get better at it. And don't go looking for specific insights, and don't even set yourself for it. In the circling community, we sometimes call that insight porn, when people are just, it's no good unless I've had a cataclysmic insight. That's not the point. The point is more to participate in a shared flow experience and have that sense of connection that we find so meaningful and that can be a source of transformation for us. The intimacy alone can be transformative, regardless of whether or not we have some big conceptual revelation.
Going off of that, and also kind of like tying it back to Thanasi's point, like in school, like I definitely agree we're not really taught how to have productive dialogue, but there are things like debate club that are options for a decent amount of people. So do you think that the type of dialogue that you were just talking about, John, can be merged with like debate at all? And if it can, would debate benefit from a more dialogue structure, I guess? I know they're like kind of polar opposites, but could they be merged?
To answer your question, I mean, in some of the work I've done in terms of trying to get a pedagogical program to get people into Dialogos, one of the things is a practice that my friend and colleague Peter Lindbergh at the Stoa calls the anti-debate. And the anti-debate goes like this. You say something, and before you're allowed to respond or criticize, you have to tell me what it is. I say something, and you have to tell me what it is I've said, and that you've completely, and until I agree that you've understood me, you can't do a criticism. And then what tends to happen is that people get more and more into the connection, into the flow, while still managing to do something like a debate. And it's a really interesting intermediary bridging practice.
That's so interesting. I wonder how it's just, I think going back to what Ashley said about just culture, it's just so in our culture to be correct and have other people be incorrect. And with formats like that, it requires both people willing to understand that they both could be incorrect and that they're willing to grow in a conversation. And it's just that there are so many like societal pushes away from even getting to that realization to start the dialogos that I wonder how you relieve those pressures.
I mean, I think that's part of why something like this has to be set into a wider ecology of practices. Plato makes a distinction between philia nikeia, the desire for victory, and philia sophia, which is, the love of wisdom. And people have to come into dialogos, not with an expectation that they're going to say something profound, but in an expectation that they're going to, almost like, an appetizer, they're going to trigger and deduce their love for wisdom as something that can take the place of their love for victory. And so there's an ecology of practices and a community of practitioners that have to be committed to that in order for something like dialogos to take shape. I take it that that's what you guys have here. So you're in a good place, I would say.
I think
kind of like Bernard's point about soccer. I want to bring it back. Like some people will play soccer to like win the game, or for a lot of people, they talk about the love of the game. And like, maybe we'll train like strength or conditioning to get better at soccer so you can play better. But like past like the collegiate or even like the high school level, like people play soccer in club leagues to have fun and to get better as a person, to experience something with other people instead of winning. So I think we need to make dialogos more like playing a game of soccer because you love to play the game, instead of like debate where you're playing so you can win the game against somebody else. Now go, Nora. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, I think a huge part of it is being able to find the medium with which you're going to have these types of dialogue or dialogos, where like when I think about things like debate, like I did debate freshman year and then I switched to speech because I didn't like being interrupted, and I was like, that's just not going to happen. And so then I would just speak for 8 minutes uninterrupted. But I think in general, like finding the medium of like, this is a way that I know I can communicate something well. And so one of the things that comes to mind is like writing, where like, despite a love for public speaking, like I'm always scared that I can't convey the same message that I can through like literal words that are being read. And I know that could really quickly turn into a monologue, but I think a friend a while back offered to like write an essay together, in which case like you're stumbling upon realizations together because you're finding that medium that works for you, as compared to like trying to force talking to get to not to arrive to a conclusion, but to have a meaningful connection.
I also think that, like, first of all, that's the first time I've ever heard of like the difference between finite or infinite conversations. And so I think if you have a debate that is bound to be infinite, you actually end up learning so much from each other. Because politics is like a reoccurring subject in my household, as it is in many now, I guess. And those are heated debates. Like, there's nothing about that is just, oh, well, I think this, or that's no, like me and my dad are really drawing lines on the table, but it still feels like a conducive conversation because I'm truly learning about his perspective. And we all know that this is a conversation that's going to continue the next time we have dinner or the next time there's a big family gathering. And so I think that if you have that duality, you're more likely to, like, again, stumble into provoking findings. So you can still kind of have that competitive spirit in this context.
It's also like looking for different things in those conversations. Like political conversations can be very like two-sided and very non-complex and monolithic. But if you are there to learn more about, like, for example, like my dad, if I'm having like more about his values, or what he believes in life or religion. Like you can pull these abstract and more like human values out of their political beliefs and those political conversations. And it just makes the conversation so much more real and intriguing.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think what is cool, I mean, like, I think debate inherently like limits your options, right? Like, there's only two things that you're considering. But I think what's cool about dialogue is that you're paying attention not only to like the perspectives and opinions of like the people actively engaged in a dialogue, but you're also just aware of all of like the perspectives that are not being expressed and actively like drawing them in. And so you end up with more than two options, which like people like most people like want more than two options.
I think what Ashley just said was quite brilliant. I think that's very good. And one of the differences that shifts this is when people bring, and that's why I think you should also have mindfulness training before you enter into, try to enter into Dialogos. Because what typically happens is people shift from the other as the opponent to that through which the other is the other through which I can transcend myself, through which I can correct myself, through which I can get outside the prison of my own egocentrism and see it from outside, which is very hard to do on your own. And when people start to appreciate the value of that, it doesn't mean that you and I have to agree, but in fact, your disagreement with me can be very, very powerfully beneficial to me. And so what happens is people start to mirror each other, not in the sense that they mimic each other, but they afford each other transcending. Everybody is affording everybody else's self-transcendence. And that, when you start to see the vertical movement as more valuable than the horizontal movement of defeating your opponent, that's when people really start, I think, to fall in love with Dialogos.
Anyone have something to add or another question or provocation to pose?
I think I don't know if I have necessarily another conversation, but or maybe I do have another question. Can one person be the roadblock to a group's transcendence in Dialogos? Does everyone in the group have to be committed to being in true Dialogos with each other in order for it to occur for everybody? Or can most people in a group be in Dialogos learning from each other, really in this infinite game without bringing the entire group along?
That's a little bit tricky to answer because it depends how the person is not in the group. If they're just sort of absent and sort of abstain, then typically in these practices or circling, it goes on. But if you have people who enter in bad faith, that they enter in order to pretend, in order to subvert, in order to try and convert rather than converse, then that will undermine the process. So that's what I mean about how this has to be there. I mean, you're entrusting yourself, and people have to do things to earn your trust, insofar as they come into it with a commitment for self-awareness and for trying to overcome self-deception and for playing the infinite game rather than winning a finite game. And you will meet people who are bad faith in that they're narcissists, and what they're doing is trying to co-opt the thing, for example, to get everybody's attention on them or their particular view. And that can be very detrimental to the practice, because those kinds of people can be very aggressive at times.
I definitely agree. But I also think that, like, depending on the size of the group, like, the person doesn't have to be a complete roadblock. It would be more just like a buffer, depending. Because if you have like a group of 3 and one person is totally going like full aggressive mode, that definitely brings the whole group down. But say you had like a group of 50 and it was 1 out of 50 and you're sharing the talking time or something, I feel like you could make some progress in that, but it would still probably be a buffer if the person was not in the right mindset.
In the same way that like someone can be a roadblock to a group's transcendence, it's beautiful to think of how like multiple people could be like the exact opposite and like be part of like the flourishing of it. which like I don't think I would have like realized unless I thought about the fact that people could be roadblocks to things. So it's cool to see how like a healthy herd mentality could be created where it's like a support system instead of someone being a roadblock or like everyone mutually agreeing just because they agree.
I think at one point maybe you get caught up, like if you are that roadblock, maybe you just get caught up and shed those bad beliefs that you have, or you can have your mindset changed. Because I feel like it would be quite hard to witness even 5 or 6 people having a really intense dialogue and really being into it, and you participating consistently without matching their flow. It's like humans are by nature very mimetic, right? So I feel like if it is that large group, you probably would fall into it without even wanting to.
I think one of the best books regarding to dialogue is Crucial Conversations. It's one of my favorite books. And what it's talking about, I think it's mentioned in the book, or if not, it's just a story a friend told me. But it was that when someone is angry or is not cooperating, what they did before having a dialogue is saying, okay, only once at the time can be angry or cannot be participating, and he leaves the conversation or the room, and we dialogue with respect among us. So only one person could be angry, and that way because when stakes are high and all people are shouting, there's no room for dialogue. There's room only for saying the people mistakes or not a dialogue. So I think trying to do that type of activities and letting only one person be angry at the time, and not letting being a roadblock. It was the way you say it, a roadblock. It can be just normalizing that we get angry and we don't share points of view, and we get emotional, because when we're dealing with people, and I think it's mentioned on Crucial Conversations, we're dealing with emotions, and we are emotional. We are not radical, and we are not thinking all the time, and that's good because we have emotions. We have to understand that we can get angry, but not leaving that to be a roadblock. I don't know if you understand me. My English is just terrible.
I'm understanding you quite well. And I think there's a couple really good points. We could pursue either one of them. I like the idea of, Noor's point. I think that's a great point about we also afford each other's self-transcendence. One of the things we often do before we get into Dialogos is we do a lot of practices at a non-controversial level to get people into the collective flow state, so they're more likely to be drawn in, as it's been suggested. And so I think that's very true. One of the things you learn to do is shift from making statements about what people have said or making statements about other people, and instead more mindfully expressing what's going on in you. Like instead of saying, I think you're wrong, or that really pisses me off, you say, I'm feeling really agitated or upset by what you said. And I'm feeling it like a pain like a constriction in my chest. And when people move to that more self-reflective mindfulness, what typically happens is they refocus on the connection between each other rather than on their conviction about the particular propositions they're saying.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. I think one of the most effective ways to guarantee productive discussion is by helping people go deeper and shift their interactions towards like personal experiences and like feelings and critical thinking versus like positions on certain issues.
So funny you say that, because I used to do Model UN in high school, as many of you probably know. But the whole argument was like, don't use anecdotes, don't use personal like stories, don't talk about yourself, like just talk about your position, just talk about the issue. And I think that's like a thing that happens to a lot of people, like debate too, and like any argument I have with my dad, if I'm like, well, I saw, he's like, why are you using anecdotes in an argument? How? Like, so it's very interesting that you bring it up that Dialogos is kind of the opposite.
I want to argue that like anecdotes are probably the most important part of a dialogue, because it provides so much context as to why you feel the way you do, not just in terms of like tactical information, but then also just like the emotional context or like the value that you place on the evidence that you're referencing. And then also just like a general point about this question, I think I'm not necessarily thinking of like a person that could be a roadblock, but a situation that could be a roadblock is like being overly fixated on the outcome or the objective, the initial objective of the conversation. And so like there needs to be welcome space for confusion or speculation, which makes me want to propose the provocation of valuing confusion in the infinite dialogue. I just feel like that's a topic worth exploring.
Wait, could you repeat it again? Sorry, I didn't catch it.
Valuing confusion in the infinite dialogue.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Chabu. I think trying to get a premature clarity, this is part of the insight porn that often happens. People, like, they race through and because they want to get to the gems. But a lot of what's happening that's of great value in that self-transcendence process is you spend a lot of time with things that are inchoate. You spend a lot of times, you really let that thing come to life. You really let it live for a while before you collectively try. It's more like cultivating a plant than making something. Right? And you let that inchoate thing be for quite a while, and people try to gently cultivate some shared clarity out of it over time. I think that's one of the most significant differences. What I want to mention, though, is and this is where sort of the Socratic model is very important. So one thing we can fall into is, maybe we could typify it by saying debate, and where we're trying to distinguish it from debate, and that's good. And it's good that, we bring in the anecdotal, we bring in the perspectival, but dialogos is also not therapy, right? It's not therapy. So and you can see this in Socrates, we're always trying to steer between debate and therapy. I mean, therapy has a value, debate has value. I'm not trying to criticize that, but dialogos is the middle path between debate and therapy.
So I guess, how do you steer your fellow, I guess, conversation members? I guess we can call them, I don't know if there's a more exact word, but how do you steer them more towards the middle if they're falling away on either side?
Well, part of it is, like I said, that there's practices that you do to get people develop the virtue. Virtue is basically golden mean, Aristotle. Virtue is about learning how to avoid excess and deficit. And so you have to do a lot of other stuff. Like dialogos should come at the end, dialectic into dialogos should come at the end of a pedagogical platform in which people have learned a lot of skills about recognizing these two things and developing some pretty developed habits about it. But what things people do typically in the practice is they try to get people, right? They try to get people on topic, so that it's something that's shared. Therapy is idiosyncratic. Dialogos should always be something that we're sharing together. So that's how you move away from therapy. Debate is but finite in victory. Dialogos, we're trying to flow infinitely. And so that's how we steer away from debate.
I'm gonna say, it seems like, therapy seems to be mostly emotional, whereas debate seems to be really strictly not rational, but very dry and factual. And I feel like dialogos has to kind of straddle between those and be rational, where we neither dip too far into either side, but we find that golden mean. And there's this book, I think it's called The Games We Play. It was based on Freud stuff. It talked about the relationship we have in conversations with other people. It can either be you're functioning as a child, as an adult, as a parent. And the thing is, therapy would be the parents trying to mentor the child. A debate would be an adult trying to debate an adult and trying to be right. I feel like dialogos has to be an adult and an adult, both in the same headspace and with good intentions, coming together to be vulnerable, but to strive to be something better. I guess it comes from the right intentions. And unless people have the right intentions and the right framing behind it, it's going to be hard to get into dialogos.
I thought that was beautiful, Jacob. Yeah, I like the idea that debate is very logical and therapy tends to be much more emotional. And Dialogos is rational, not in the sense of being logical, but in the more important sense of trying to overcome self-deception, egocentrism, the need to defeat other people. So it's a broader sense of rationality. It's a Socratic sense of rationality. It's about helping people give birth to their better selves. We're all, I like Socrates' metaphor, we're all trying to be midwives to each other.
That said, I think even while Dialogos is kind of built on rationality, I think emotion is still a really big aspect of it. I think therapy is like people turning inwards and kind of exploring their emotions on their own. But I think when it comes to like infinite games are all about like vulnerability and openness, right? I think Dialogos is about like mutually like accelerating disclosure. Like you are sharing parts of yourself with others and inviting other people into that journey to help figure out and make sense of what you're feeling. And I think that's different from therapy because like therapy is like you trying to figure out yourself. And it's like less of like a journey that is embarked on collectively.
I think that's beautiful, Ashley. Mutual accelerating disclosure is how you fall in love. And I don't mean just romantic love, it's love, it's fellowship, it's philia, Sophia, it's philia. That's what we're trying to engender. And the notion of rationality that I'm talking about, the Socratic Platonic, is not something that's opposed to emotion. That's a romantic, I mean, in the sense of the romantics, philosophers, that's a romantic dichotomy I reject. I think the love of truth, the love of beauty, the love of goodness is what powers rationality. If you're not loving virtue, if you're not loving wisdom, you're not going to engage in Dialogos at all. And so if you don't have some kind of love for realization, like becoming aware of what's real, you're not going to engage in self-correction, self-transcendence. So I think that there's a deep love, philia, that is integral to this practice.
I also think, I know you didn't say romantic love, but I think it is a crucial part of romantic love, because if you can't figure out how to love your surroundings and love the conversations that you have and continually like love the world, you can't impose that love onto another human because you'll never be able to truly understand them.
Oh, I agree. I think I mean, I have a lot of criticisms of the fact, in fact, that the fact that we call it romantic love and the romantics get to tell us about it, I think is kind of a problem that our culture faces. But I think what we call romantic relationships have all three kinds of love in them. They should have properly should have eros, philia, and agape.
No, I wholeheartedly agree about the idea of like over-referencing the romantics, or even just like having to use romantic love as the only like real example that we have, that we mutually understand as a society, in ways that we like just care deeply and in a really meaningful way about the things that are around us. Which makes me just think about, just like generally speaking, the only way to kind of incentivize people towards dialogos is to explain what they can get out of it. And then the only way to explain that is to say they like it's a sense of love that you'll kind of find throughout that process.
Yeah, that's why I'm trying to resurrect and revitalize this notion of fellowship as a way of trying to remind people that we used to have the kind of love that was really crucial to human flourishing, that wasn't romantic love, and really matters. And the reason I choose the word fellowship is because it's between these concepts that we have in our society, romantic love and friendship. There's something in between that I'm trying to point at with this term fellowship.
Okay, I think that's a good point to transition. I'm going to go ahead and copy the link to the notes and send them in the chat for you all to look at. And while you're thinking of your reflection, I can go ahead and share mine. So obviously, very good conversation about dialogue. And I would say, like, based on the conversation about roadblocks, I think most of the time in reaching like a productive or a good dialogue, the roadblock is not a person. It's more of like excuses and like a lot of like, I guess like debate norms creeping into conversations. Like what I mean by excuses is like people making like excuses that dialogue can't happen anywhere. Like what Bernardo said about the soccer analogy, that was profound. About like, I know there's times when there's opportunity to have small talk, but I'm like, you know, like this is not the place or something like that. Like I make some sort of excuse. And then for debate, obviously, I find myself a lot of times doing the opposite of what John mentioned, where it's like having productive conversations and like stating what you feel, and then instead opting for like saying things as like objective statements, but that ends up making the conversation actually very unproductive. So leaving with a couple of realizations and tools for future conversations. So thank you all for that.
I think my totally unfinished reflection, because I don't think I can reflect upon this conversation in like 5 minutes, but is that I think humans are in a constant strive for consciousness, right? We drop acid, we have a lot of sex and look for money and power or whatever to reach this field of consciousness. And, you know, some people go out to the mountains of like East Asia and try to achieve it for years. But I wonder if Dialogos is a way for us to collectively and quickly achieve consciousness, maybe not for our entire lives, but for points where it's needed to make decisions or just be clear. I don't know if that at all makes sense, but that's where my brain is.
That's interesting. That reminds me of the phrase that's like roughly, I think John may have mentioned this, like people, yeah, I mean, people sort of become persons through each other, right? Like they I guess they midwife each other. You know, can you really understand your own humanity if you don't have opportunities to fully experience other people's and see other people experience yours?
Yeah, I mean, if we think about it very carefully, we are born out of, I mean, I don't mean biologically, but we're born as persons, as rationally, morally reflective agents in dialogue. That's how we basically turn, you know, infants into people. It's largely through dialogos. So I agree with that.
I think something that is on my mind, and maybe this is like a tiny bit of a provocation too, but you know, like at CU, we're pretty obsessed with processes and like creating processes for things. But our conversation kind of around like, you know, how do we make dialogue, like how do we create more access to like dialogue spaces? I think part of what the conversation helped me realize was that like dialogue doesn't come from just procedural knowing, which is what I think processes are. Like inherently, like processes, like you create steps for people to do something. But I mean, like using John's language, right? Like there needs to be like perspectival and like participatory knowing in dialogue. And I guess I'm just wondering, like, how do we go beyond just creating a process for something to actually help people, you know, like experience that? But like then that's not very scalable. So I don't know. I'm just wondering, like, how do we go beyond creating processes for dialogue?
So that's, I think, a central question, Ashley. And part of the way of getting the perspectival and the participatory and this goes towards the, you know, the topic of self-consciousness, self-reflection, is for people to experience self-transcendence in it, in the experience. And getting the participatory in is to bring in a topic that engages both the perspectival and the participatory. And I think it's not a coincidence that the Platonic dialogues are all about virtue, because virtue is how we aspire, how we self-transcend, but we can't do that in an abstract way. We have to do it existentially. We have to participate. You can't talk about honesty unless you have it to some degree and you're participating in it and you're aspiring to it more. So one of the things I'm exploring is the fact that what we talk about can be, you know, we should choose it very carefully so that it will tend to bring in the perspectival and the participatory knowing.
One of the things I'm thinking about is how I feel like at some point we talked about how sacred dialogue is or needs to be or can be. and in my mind, the first thing that like I associated with that was the fact that, like, when something is sacred, it doesn't happen often, and like it, like in that moment something like magical happens. But I think just in terms of reflecting, like to reach a point where something so sacred is so widespread and like widely experienced, is something that like just rekindles that idea of like being conscious and having that humanity. And like when I think of kind of going back, like when I think of small talk, I'm like, a lot of people see it as like a very surface level thing. But like if it could be something as widespread and common, while also having the same depth, I think that that's something that like, it's just like it's something that's cool to think about.
Kind of going off of that too, I wasn't thinking about dialogue as sacred in the same way. I was thinking more about it as just like talking, having a conversation. But so because we've been talking about that, it's made me realize that like the quality of the dialogue is better than the quantity of it, because I have conversations with like my dad all the time, and I always considered them like, oh, it's a dialogue, but I'm rethinking it. I'm like, no, that was a debate. That was just a 3-hour long debate between us, and we didn't actually get very far because both of us were getting kind of frustrated with the other person. But now trying to engage in a conversation where it's not someone just preaching or anything, where it's actually trying to learn about the other person, what they think, and grow from it.
Sam, what that made me think of was how we talked about sharing, how a lot of dialogues are just sharing monologues. And how can we, why would we expect people to be good at dialogue if what they're seeing on like CNN or Fox News is monologue, just like, I'm a monologue here. No, I'm gonna monologue as like it's like you're using like monologues as like a baseball bat. You're like, no, like you're like attacking someone. Yet we're told that this is what civic dialogue is. You get two enemies on both sides. That's how we build the future.
And on the note of focusing on like building the future, I think that, again, dialogue is one of those tools. I'll circle back to like my initial provocation. Dialogue is one of those tools that is always relevant. And I find myself applying the principles of dialogue to like how I engage in all work. And the idea of like finite versus infinite conversations makes me think about the fact that like whatever we're building is a infinite process. And so right now we're in the stage where we're treating it like a baseball bat and it's one thing to the next. But because it's infinite, we're also treating it like it's infinite, which is kind of what my biggest takeaway here also means, that like that spirit and enjoyment from learning and coming to realizations is just like promised throughout the process. So there's something beautiful in that. And I feel like that's just applicable to any work that's being done, or even any personal work that's being done.
I would just like to amplify what Chabu said. I think it's beautiful. One of the things I say to people, one of the ways of knowing if you've been in Dialogos is you'll find that it's permeating through your life and it's percolating between levels of your psyche. That's one of the ways retrospectively you can tell if you've been in Dialogos.
I love the way that we cooperate, to keep the analogy of soccer, and I think that's the clue for dialogue, cooperation. If there is cooperation only by one side and there is not for the other, it's a monologue. I think that's why, because they were saying in the comment like, I think here we're having a dialogue, correct? Because there is cooperation by all the people. If there is no cooperation, then we're just saying nonsense words, and there is not room for dialogue. And cooperation and respect are the main pillars for a correct dialogue, because yeah, you can name it dialogue, you can name it whatever you want, but if you want to have a correct dialogue, I think cooperation and respect are the pillars.
Absolutely. I mean, I think dialogue is all about like the intention of the participants and like realizing that this is the space where you can like reveal thoughts that kind of were buried underneath in the back of your mind and make those connections with other people who are also undergoing that same process. So I think, understanding dialogue as a process that requires dedication is important.
I'm not going to engage in a reflection about Dialogos because that's sort of my job and I'm doing it all the time. Instead, I'm going to reflect on what's happened here. I was really impressed and deeply encouraged. So that's what I'll say from my reflection.
Yeah, thank you, John. It was a very good conversation. And thank you to all of you. I really enjoyed this. And John, would love to have you on again in the future if you're up for it at some point. But yeah, thank you all for your time.
Of course, I'll come back if you want.
Yeah, great. And you can pick the topic as well.
Okay.
All right. And yeah, thank you all for your time. And I will see you later. Bye.
If possible, I just want to say one more thank you to John real quick. I've been listening to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, episode 50, outside on my lounge chair. And I popped up a notification that said like, oh yeah, John Vervaeke is streaming live Gen Z Changemakers. So when I clicked on that, I saw Madison and Shabu speaking. And that's what showed me what Civics Unplugged was.
Oh,
the way I learned about Civics Unplugged was through you. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're really welcome. Glad to hear that. Thanks, everyone. Take good care.
Thank you. Bye.